You come to me for knowledge. I remember the long, maddening hours of hyperspace. I can feel your impatience, and you are wise to seek to occupy yourself. But do not neglect your negative feelings. Your frustration will drive you. Your training continues to progress well, and I feel you have begun to collect the parts for your lightsaber. Good. Soon you will receive the instructions on how to build it, but until then, we will turn back to our studies of powerful figures. When last we spoke on the matter, it was Kreia the Wise that was the subject of our conversation. We spoke on her teachings, and on how to master the ability to view the tides of fate. Now we will discuss perhaps the most powerful Sith to ever live, and one who mastered the ability of manipulation. This Dark Lord would conquer the entire galaxy and rule as Emperor for decades. It was only his arrogance that led to him losing his grip on power. Accessing file. Darth Sidious. Processing. He was born as the human male, Sheev Palpatine on the planet Naboo, to the aristocrat Cosigna Palpatine. The family was wealthy and powerful, a ruling family on Naboo. Sheev would recognize something different about himself from an early age, sensing that deep within he had a latent power. This would drive him to be naturally ambitious, and he believed himself a born leader. He was extremely intelligent, and as he became a teenager, he began to push for his family to take a more active role in Naboo politics. His father, however, was more content with what they had, and this seeded a deep resentment within Palpatine. He grew to disdain his parents for their weakness and lack of ambition. Frustrated by their restrictions, he turned his free time to esoterica and began to collect and study Sith artifacts from the black market. Slowly, he began to realize the dimmest traces of the path to power, and he began to keep his eyes peeled for an opportunity to rise above his station. These underworld connections carried over with Palpatine as he began education in the wider galaxy. Several times he was caught for petty crimes or misdemeanors, but each time Cosigna used his wealth to make it disappear. Palpatine began to learn that with money, and as such power, there were no real consequences to his actions. He learned he could have whatever he wanted, and that power could set him free. Eventually, he would become old enough where he would have to enroll in Naboo's mandatory public service, and he became embroiled with the Legislative Youth Program. There, he would begin to make contacts and acquaintances. He would come to believe that it was time to open Naboo to the wider galaxy, while his father would continue to hold more conservative views. Finally, this rift would come to a head during Naboo's monarchical elections. Palpatine's father would support the isolationist candidate, and Sheev would work to undermine Consigna's efforts. As part of this, the young boy would release documents which directly harmed his own family's image. Little known to Palpatine, outside forces had a stake in Naboo's election. They too wished the planet open to the wider galaxy, and he inadvertently aided the cause of one Hugo Damask, the leader of Damask Holdings, one of the wealthiest corporations in the galaxy. Damask was secretly the Sith Lord Darth Plagueis, a man we will speak more on detail later. He would reach out to arrange a meeting with the young Naboo who had helped him. and the two would meet under Plagueis' public guise while Sheev was at university in Theed. There, he would discover that he was unable to look into Palpatine with the Force, and this would drive him to hire the young boy as a spy. Palpatine would agree to this, but only if he could report directly to Plagueis alone. The two would begin a close relationship, which would eventually become obvious to Consigna Palpatine. Consigna would attempt to restrict his son's access to Plagueis, and would even threaten the Dark Lord himself. After this threat, Plagueis would contact Palpatine and stoke the frustration and anger the boy was carrying for his family. He would tell him that he must do whatever he had to in order to free himself from their clutches and seize the reins of his own destiny. So it would come to pass that Consigna would eventually confront his son aboard the family yacht, and the two's hatred for one another would finally explode into the open. In that moment, the younger Palpatine would instinctively call upon the power of the dark side and slaughter his entire family, their guards, everyone aboard the vessel. The boy would then call Plagueis, who would help him cover up the crime, setting Palpatine up to inherit his father's estate. Afterwards, Plagueis would formally induct Palpatine into the Order of the Sith, naming him Darth Sidious and making him his Sith apprentice. Sidious's training would begin almost immediately and focused on his combat skills and esoteric knowledge within the Force. But it also focused on his skill as a politician. Sidious began to work as the public face of the Sith plan, working for their interest from within the government. Plagueis was the power behind the man, funding much of Palpatine's endeavors and laying the groundwork for the next phase of their plan. Palpatine's early political career was mediocre. He lost more elections than he won, but he was focused mainly on his Sith training. He thirsted after knowledge about the Sith more than anything, but Plagueis would only give him a little at a time. Eventually, Palpatine would work his way up to becoming the aide to Galactic Senator Vidar Kim. A position as his aide put the young Sidious in range of the Galactic Senate. Time would pass. Sidious would grow both in the Force and as a politician. Plagueis and Sidious would eventually agree that the time had come to put into motion the final stages of their plans. Plagueis would order Sidious to assassinate Vidar Kim, and Sidious would contact an individual known as Satay Pestage to accomplish his task. The assassination would be successful, and Sidious would go on to win election to the Galactic Senate in Kim's place. Pestage would become a close friend to Sidious, and he would later find himself placed high in the power structure of the Galactic Empire. Throughout his time in politics, Sidious would show a rare ability to form connections to people. He would do something few others in his position could do. He would listen. Sidious had the ability to become a confidant, and the ease with which he assumed this position allowed him to get to know those around him, learn their desires and their goals, their wants and ambitions. This let Sidious determine how best exactly to make use of them, and slowly he began to build a network of connections. He was from a small backwater world in the Rim, and most senators expected little to nothing from him. An illusion Sidious worked hard to maintain. He purposefully kept the advancement of his career at a crawl, knowing that by letting some opportunities go, he could continue to appear harmless and without resources. Over time, his strategy began to work. He wrote extensively, and his papers on politics became things taught in universities across the galaxy. Despite growing fame, He would continue to maintain a mild-mannered public demeanor. He would almost never attend social gatherings, and seemed to the outside world to devote all his time to his work. Behind the scenes, however, Sidious continued to grow as a Sith. Finally, a moment of crux would arrive. A vote would come up in the Senate to seat several new worlds, worlds that belonged to the Trade Federation. Plagueis wished for these worlds to join the Senate, and for them to become trapped between a bureaucracy that taxed them dry and a corporation that exploited them. This would pave the way for a future separatist crisis that would tear the Republic apart. Sidious was expected to vote against the Trade Federation, but instead made a show of the affair, accusing the Trade Federation of the assassination of Vidar Kim and abstaining from the vote in the process. This action allowed the Trade Federation to seat their new worlds in the Senate, and it also worked to increase Sidious's public image. This furthered the Sith's grand plan. However, it also exposed Plagueis and Sidious to their enemies, as the two were spotted speaking together in the Senate Plaza. With their relationship exposed, they would come under attack by hired assassins, and while they would manage to fend off the attack and destroy the one who hired them, Plagueis would be gravely wounded in the assault. Afterwards, he would withdraw from public life. Sidious would now use his newfound publicity in the Senate to skyrocket into a position of influence. He would begin to form connections to people from all areas of governance, from the Senate building to the military, even among the Jedi Order. These connections would allow Sidious unprecedented access to the highest levels of power in the galaxy. He would use this access to implicate then Chancellor Valorum in criminal proceedings and seriously weaken his hold on power. About the same time, Plagueis would arrange for the abdication of the King of Naboo, which would directly lead to the coronation of Queen Padme Amidala. Shortly afterward, Sidious would order the Trade Federation to blockade the planet in protest of Republic trade tax laws. The air of instability and insurrection within the galaxy would grow to heights that had not been seen in 1,000 years. Everything was unfolding exactly as the Sith had planned. However, the blockade of Naboo did not create the full upswelling of sympathy that was expected to carry Sidious into the Chancellor's office. A full invasion of the planet was decided to be the best course of action, and the Sith ordered the Federation to see it done. Through a series of events caused directly by the political crisis he had orchestrated against his own homeworld, Sidious would find himself in the office of High Chancellor. He would win by a large margin, promising to restore the faded glories of the old Republic. Shortly after that, Naboo would be liberated, and the Trade Federation publicly embarrassed. For years, Sidious had been subtly manipulating his master, feeding him ideas for the grand plan without his knowing. Plagueis had thought to become co-chancellor, and that Sidious would pass laws only approved by him. But Sidious had never had any intention of sharing power, and with his rise to the highest levels complete, Plagueis had outlived his usefulness. The night prior to Sidious's election, the two would gather to celebrate. Sidious would ply his master with wine, and the moon would pass into unconsciousness. Then, Sidious would strike. He would blast Plagueis with torrents of Sith lightning, and the Dark Lord would die there on the couch, half drunk, half asleep, a powerful man whose destiny had been twisted by his apprentice. Sidious had used Plagueis' greater power, his greater destiny, to further his own. He had seen that the moon's power carried true weight in the Force, and like gravity, this weight could affect the orbits of those around it. He used Plagueis to grow his own power, further his own weight in the Force, and it had grown heavier than his master's. So he deposed him and eliminated his rival. Sidious would assume the mantle of Dark Lord, and shortly after, he would finally meet the young Anakin Skywalker. The Jedi Order was abuzz with the possibility that he could be the prophesied chosen one, and Sidious resolved almost immediately that the boy would become his final apprentice. Like Plagueis, Sidious knew that the boy's destiny could be used to further his own. But Sidious had been swept up in Plagueis' destiny, and had to use it to grow himself. This time, Sidious would need to ensure the young Skywalker became swept up in his wake. In this way, the Chosen One could be twisted to serve the Sith. Over the following years, Sidious would cement his power. He would manipulate his way into the creation of the Red Guard, the personal guard which would eventually grow into the Royal Guard of the Empire, expressly against Republic principles. He would manage to get re-elected, all while maintaining a stasis in the corruption rampant in the galaxy, and working towards enacting the next phase of the Sith Grand Plan. Years ago, Sidious and his master had manipulated the Jedi Master Sifo Dyas into ordering the creation of a clone army from the cloners of Kamino. They had also stoked the flames of discontent to fever pitch all along the Outer Rim. The time had become ripe. Sidious used his new apprentice, Darth Tyrannus, to unite these disaffected systems under a common cause, and a true separatist movement began to form. Sidious would make public displays of reason, often pleading with his own apprentice, in his public guise as Count Dooku, to come to the table before it was too late. Terrorist attacks and demonstrations began to become commonplace in the Rim, while the Separatists appeared cold and implacable over their refusal to negotiate. Eventually, the Jedi Master Obi-Wan Kenobi would obtain proof that the Separatists were building an army on the world of Geonosis. Sidious would approach the Jedi Council and other officers of government to try to determine the best course of action. As the debate wound on, it became clear that the Senate would not be able to overcome their bickering long enough to act. And on prior prompting from Sidious, his aide and friend Mas Amedda would suggest that emergency wartime powers would give the Chancellor the ability to order an army immediately. The motion would go to the floor the next day, championed by a Gungan named Jar Jar Binks, and it would pass with flying colors. Sidious would win emergency powers and the full love of the Senate in a single day. He would legally approve the Clone Army as the Grand Army of the Republic, and the Clone Wars would begin in earnest. We will not discuss that history here. What is important to note is that during this time, Palpatine would begin to focus his attentions on the young Anakin Skywalker. The Dark Lord would employ the same strategies that he did throughout his life. He adopted the role of confidant and became a surrogate father to the boy. He got to know him, and he did so for one reason. Skywalker's destiny was evident to any with even the smallest inkling, and Palpatine instinctively knew that his own power could only be served by finding a way to shift the tides of fate in such a way that Skywalker would become his tool. Sidious had done everything possible to take the reins of fate for himself. He was in control of both sides of a galaxy-spanning war, and his natural gifts and foresight allowed him to stay one step ahead of the Jedi. Eventually, he would manipulate events into culminating during a confrontation with some of the Jedi's most powerful masters, a confrontation Skywalker would bear witness to. By the end, the young boy would be forced to make a choice. And because Sidious knew him so well, knew of his secret marriage and love for Padme Amidala, he was able to force him to his will. Skywalker would betray the Jedi and swear himself to Sidious, taking the name of Darth Vader and joining the Sith. After this, Sidious would deliver a special order to his clone troopers, Order 66. The clones had been raised as loyal soldiers since the day they were born, subjected to psychological conditioning and suggestive implantation. This order caused them to turn on the Jedi fighting with them on the front lines. At the same time, Sidious dispatched the newly minted Lord Vader to the Jedi Temple with orders to leave none alive. The Jedi were all but destroyed, reduced to a few scant members who would be hunted down or forced into hiding on remote worlds. Sidious would then order Vader to destroy the leaders of the Separatist movement, whom he had gathered in one place. With the war won, and the Jedi destroyed, Sidious used his emergency powers to reorganize the Galactic Republic into the Galactic Empire, with himself ruling as the first Emperor. So proficient was Sidious at recognizing the threads of destiny, at knowing how and when to pull them, at knowing just what pressures to apply to those around him, that he was able to achieve the singular goal of the Sith in a single stroke. What came next was known as imperialization. Entire sectors of the galaxy were renamed to fit the new empire, whole bureaucracies reorganized or erased. The Grand Army of the Republic and many local defense forces were merged to create the infamous Imperial military. Across the galaxy, Sidious tightened his control. In the next decades, the Empire would be fully his. Any existing Jedi would be hunted down by Lord Vader. Planetary holdouts would be brutally crushed by Imperial forces, and powerful superweapons would begin to be built. Sidious would dive deeper than ever before into Sith esoterica, and his powers would expand to never-before-dreamed-of heights. His ultimate goal was immortality, and he began to enact several plans to achieve this end. He began to turn the deep core world abyss into a secret fortress. The planet was a dark side nexus, and he fed on both the energy there and the life force of slaves from dozens of worlds within the Empire to extend his life. He visited Korriban and learned from the long-dead Sith Lords there. He even began to compose his own works on the dark side, the Book of Sith and the Dark Side Compendium. These books hold much knowledge, and you should hunt down copies if you can. They have become rare, but they do exist still in the galaxy, with collectors of esoteric lore or dark side relics. Finally, with his Death Star complete, the Emperor would completely abolish the Senate, and all semblance of the old Republic would be obliterated. But at the zenith of his power, Sidious still had not fully cemented his victory. Strength can always be earned, and with it your chains shattered. But there is something which many do not know, another aspect to strength that few are ever prepared for. After you gain strength, you will be tested. This is true universally. Sidious had gained ultimate power. To keep it, he would have to pass the ultimate test. In response to his increased tyranny, a grassroots rebellion began to sweep across the galaxy. Eventually, it would come together into the Rebel Alliance, and civil war would rage in the galaxy as the Empire attempted to put down the armed insurrection. The Emperor's Death Star would be destroyed, but in the long run he did not truly care. The rebellion was useful to him, if only to accustom the galaxy to full martial law. His true focus became Luke Skywalker, the pilot who destroyed the Death Star, and Anakin Skywalker's son. Sidious and Vader began to hunt for the boy, hoping to turn him to the dark side of the Force. We will not go into the details of this conflict here either. What is important is the fact that Sidious's abilities at manipulation and foresight were pushed to the limit. He had to almost constantly call upon the Force, both to peer into the future and to sustain battle meditation for his troops and fleets. His machinations grew ever more complex, but they were constantly successful. Eventually, the Galactic Civil War, as it would be called, would culminate in the skies above the forest moon of Endor. There, the Emperor was building a second Death Star, and he had manipulated the rebellion into believing the station was vulnerable. In fact, it was a fully operational battle station, and the Imperial fleet caught the rebellion in a vice-grip embrace built of its full might. Luke Skywalker had also been brought before Sidious. The Dark Lord had foreseen that the young boy's compassion would bring him to give himself up in order to save his father. There, on the Death Star, Sidious would goad Luke into a confrontation with Vader. The two would battle, with Sidious pushing the young boy to give in to the dark side to defeat his father. But he was undone. Luke refused to strike his father down. In fact, he disarmed himself before the Emperor, and when Sidious tried to kill the boy, Vader would turn on him to try to save his son. Their familial bond would pull Vader back to the light, and he would sacrifice himself to kill Sidious. But this was not the end. As I have said, Sidious was one of the most naturally talented individuals to ever live in foresight. He was also a gifted strategist and tactician, and he had long ago laid down contingencies for himself. Sidious, like his master before him, had no intention of ever dying. He had long ago formed a plan, using science and Sith alchemy, to prevent this. And on Biss, Darth Sidious had prepared hundreds of clones for himself, empty vessels which his essence could be transferred into. It took him years, but eventually his spirit would find its way to Biss, and there he inhabited a new body. But there was a cost. The clones were not natural, and as such could not long contain Sidious or his dark side power before breaking down. While this wasn't an immediate concern because of the Emperor's cloning facilities, it did mean Sidious would eventually need to find a more permanent solution. He would slowly begin to rebuild his strength, slowly begin to reconsolidate his forces. Sidious was patient, as ever, and his war factories and engineers began to produce new ships and superweapons for his arsenal. He allowed the Imperial warlords to bicker amongst themselves, viewing their conflicts as a harrowing which would winnow the weak from among them. Over time, he would find himself once more in control of most of Imperial forces, and then he would strike. Sidious would reveal himself again to the galaxy, while at the same time kidnapping Luke Skywalker. On Biss, Luke, confronted with Sidious's terrible power, would see that the only means of resistance would be from within. He bent the knee to Sidious, though this was only a ruse. From the inside, Luke would work to halt the advance of Sidious's dark empire. Sidious was fully aware of Luke's actions, but he was also aware of the powerful allure of the dark side. He knew that the longer Luke was close to him, the more he learned, the further he would fall into the grips of the Bogon. And so he waited, and used his innate tactical genius and long years of experience to counter Skywalker's sabotage. Skywalker would eventually rebel against his new master, and he would destroy all the clones in Sidious's cloning facility save one. In this last body, Sidious would defeat Skywalker, and it would take the intercession of his sister, Leia Organa Solo, to bring him back. Once fully redeemed to the light side of the Force, Luke would be able to disarm Sidious, and then together he and Leia would temporarily sever Sidious's connection to the Force. This would cause one of the Dark Lord's Force storms to lose control and destroy the vessel they were on. Luke and Leia would barely escape, and his spirit would attempt to flee to a batch of secret auxiliary clones in a new attempt at resurrection. However, Sidious's own servants would be in the midst of betraying him, and he would be left with only a single clone body to inhabit. He would resume his conquest, but he would find himself unable to halt the degeneration of his physical form. Eventually, Sidious would learn that he could break the cycle of regeneration by taking the body of one naturally born and strong in the Force. He would learn that Leia had recently given birth to a new son, and he would decide that this child would be his new permanent body. He would attack the Onderon system, where the Solo family was attempting to hide, and there he would engage in a final confrontation with Leia, Han, and Luke. He would overcome Leia, but before he could complete his plan, he would be shot down by Han Solo. Sidious's spirit would try to flee into the young boy, but he would end up being dragged down into the netherworld of the Force before he could succeed. He would become trapped there forever, howling in madness. What is there to learn from the tale of Darth Sidious? He learned well the lessons of Darth Tyia. Though a naturally gifted individual, Sidious's true strength lay in his ability to perceive and manipulate the tides of fate. He was smart, objective, and desired power, and to obtain that power, he would bide his time, wait, learn all he could about the people around him. He would truly come to know them, perhaps better than they knew themselves. And once he did, he obtained power over them. When you know a man's likes and dislikes, his hopes and fears, you can arrange situations that take advantage of these things. This is nowhere more evident than in his corruption of Anakin Skywalker. Skywalker was the chosen one, the champion of the Force, and yet because Sidious knew his deepest fears, he was able to manipulate him. The truth is that Sidious never truly corrupted Anakin. He simply set the board in such a way that Anakin had no choice but submission. In so doing, he moved the weight of Anakin's destiny behind his own. Sidious had planned years, every meticulous step of his ascension, but it was only when he could fully count destiny on his side that he truly achieved his goals. And achieve them he did. Sidious would rule the galaxy for decades and plague it for decades more, and yet he too would eventually fall. As I said before, ultimate power is always accompanied by the ultimate test. Sidious, in all his wisdom, never accepted that his power would ever be challenged. He craved unlimited reach, but the easiest way to raise his ire was to challenge him. As such, his ability to plan and to manipulate was handicapped. He could not brook contest against his rule, and as such all of his plans were arranged to eliminate it. If he had only accepted the second half of the test of strength, he could have prepared for it more fully, not made the same mistakes in trying to break a second Skywalker. Know this. It is the way of the Sith to invite challenge. No power comes unearned, and the scramble to the top is only the beginning. Those who have power will always attract those who desire it. And before you can be secure in your power, you must understand this. Sidious achieved his goals, but in the end, his aims were undone, and he failed the test of strength. Imagine if he had simply killed Luke Skywalker when he had the chance. Perhaps only one other being in history has ever come as close as Sidious to complete domination. This person shares many similarities, and it is from them that Sidious should have learned of the lesson of challenge to power. But that is a tale for another time. For now, meditate on what I have said. Return when you have progressed further in your training. Go now, and may the Force break your chains.